You're listening to Milwaukee Mafia, your podcast dose of Wisconsin Mafia and true crime history.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Milwaukee Mafia. I'm Eric.
I'm Gavin.
Gavin, we're back. Winding down a long string of podcast episodes we've been recording here, huh?
We have, yeah, because somebody likes to flee the country.
Every once in a while.
Yeah.
So
I'll still be here, but you'll be off gallivanting with people in other nations. But yeah, so I got a mafia here, and it's kind of an unusual one because it's not going to be about the Milwaukee Mafia.
all right. That's what the people come here for.
I know.
Stories not about the Milwaukee Mafia.
I know.
Does it include Milwaukee at all? Or?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's at least we got half of it.
Yes. So you and I talked to a guy the other day, and during the course of the conversation, I explained to him how we went through the first 50 years really fast. Like, we did 50 years in under a year.
Right.
And there was some concern that, at that pace, we're almost at the end of the timeline. And no.
Not at all.
Not at all. And I bring this up to say that we're going to be in the 1960, 1961, 1962, those couple of years. We're going to be sitting here a while. So I hope people are totally okay with that, because we're slowing down. We're going extra thorough from here on out. So if you're like, man, are we ever going to get up to 1970? Yeah, we are.
But it's going to take a long time.
It's going to take a little while. We're covering everything. So just so people know that's why it's going the pace that it is. So guess what we have today?
I have no idea what we have today.
We have a Chicago Heights story.
Okay.
Are you familiar with Chicago Heights?
I've heard of it.
Okay.
I know nothing about where it is or anything.
Okay,
like that,
Chicago Heights is just south, well, maybe not just south, but it's south of Chicago. It was historically one of the big mafia strongholds in the Chicago area. Possibly still is. I'm not really all that familiar with the current events, but traditionally it was one of the major suburbs for the Chicago mob. And so our guy we're talking about today is a man named Sam Guzzino, which is a fun name to say. And he was born in Chicago Heights, spent pretty much his entire life in Chicago Heights, spent his time with the Chicago Heights faction of the mob. So, Chicago Heights story this time.
So, do I dare ask the question, why are we covering this particular story if the guy's from Chicago?
We'll get to that really fast.
All right.
We'll get that almost immediately. Okay, so he's born in 1930, just to give you a sense of the time frame here. He first comes to the attention of the FBI when he's involved in a prostitution arrest in Florida, of all places, 1955. He doesn't live in Florida. He still lives in Chicago Heights, so exactly why he's mixed up in prostitution in Florida, I'm not sure. Not relevant to today. What is relevant to today, December 20th, 1959. Sam Guzzino, who's now a tavern keeper, is with truck driver Ralph Galderio and appliance repairman Alex Bender. They attempt to burglarize an A&P store at 1009 Marquette Avenue in South Milwaukee.
Okay, and there we are.
There we are.
What year was this?
1959, December 1959.
And you said that it was at an AM PM gas station.
Not an AM PM, an A&P.
Okay, I was gonna say, man, AM PMs have been around that long.
Maybe, but no, an A&P. All right. So they meet at Bender's house at 5:00. They discuss their crime, and then they travel to Milwaukee around 8 p.m. in Guzzino's fancy new Cadillac. They took 41 North to Rawson Avenue, and then Guzzino dropped the men off while Guzzino waited in the parked car. They took a long plank from the South Milwaukee Lumber Company next door and used it to get to the roof, where they made a hole to drop down inside. I don't know how long this plank is.
But it must have been pretty long.
Must have been pretty long, because they made a ramp all the way to the roof. They had first unscrewed a vent, but determined that the drop down the vent was too far, so instead they made a hole with a crowbar. When they got to the safe inside, they noticed it had been pried open recently. So they did not try to open it. They're wondering, somebody beat us to the job. They went back out. Patrolman James Breezemeister, and sorry if I goofed that one, was doing his rounds when he saw Guzzino flash his lights and stopped to investigate. Guzzino was arrested and brought to the police station where he confessed and was found to have $338 in cash on him.
You dirty man.
Yeah, the other two ran from the lumberyard, but Breezemeister fired over their heads with his pistol to get their attention, get them to stop. The pair ran to East Ryan Road in Oak Creek, so I'm not exactly sure how far that is from South Milwaukee, but general area. I mean, it's not like they're running several miles.
Mm-hmm.
They dropped their tools, their burglary tools, and a .45 on the way, before being picked up by a young man in a small foreign car. The man brought them to a service station at 10617 South 27th Street in Franklin. I'm being very precise with my addresses here. Bender called the radio cab company and was transferred to the Cudahy Cab Company. The dispatcher became suspicious and contacted the police. When Galderio was caught, he admitted his role and said Bender was the ringleader and had cased the supermarket the previous October, so 2 months earlier. Bender denied knowing anything about the crime. The patrolman was paying close attention to supermarkets. This very same A&P had been hit just a week ago and had $5,000 stolen from the safe, which is why the safe still had pry marks on it. Breezemeister had only been on the job a few months, but he had police work in his blood. His father, Frank Breezemeister, had been the chief of police for 31 years. Yeah. All right. 2 days later, Guzzino and Galderio were released on $5,000 bond. Their initial court date was set for January 4th. Alex Bender turned out to be an alias. His real name was Stephen Kramer, a man who had jumped bail after being arrested for burglarizing 2 Connecticut post offices and stealing $21,000 from those post offices. He was handed over to federal authorities because it's not cool to steal from post offices. Yeah. And if you're stealing from post offices, I don't know, like it doesn't say this, but that might not even be the post office's money. Like, you might be stealing people's checks or stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, because you would think $21,000 in a single post office
seems like weird. A lot, yeah.
But then again,
maybe
if every time somebody was mailing something, back then they were probably paying in cash.
I mean, it's possible.
Big enough post office, I could see that.
It's a lot of stamps, but
yeah.
Could be. A Chicago informant later claimed that he witnessed Chicago Heights capo, the boss in Chicago Heights, Frank Laporte, walk into the Chicago Heights Police Department and use the telephone to call a state's attorney in Wisconsin. Laporte allegedly offered the attorney $1,500 to drop the charges against Guzzino. The informant did not know this attorney's name.
So why would he walk into a police department just to make this phone call?
It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, they're implying here that the police department is corrupt in Chicago Heights. But why he would have to use their phone, I don't know.
Yeah, that's very bizarre.
On Monday, January 4th, so maybe 2 weeks later, Guzzino and Galderio were bound over for trial, and their bail was increased to $10,000 by Judge Robert Hansen. Their attorney was Dominic Frinzi, the well-known attorney of the Milwaukee mob.
I was just going to say that name sounds very familiar.
Yes.
So
he filed a writ of habeas corpus, which is what you do to try to get people released from jail. Judge Myron Gordon denied it, saying that he felt there was nothing unconstitutional about raising the bail. He said, "These guys are staying put. I am unable to say that constitutional rights were violated by the bail increase," he said. And he said releasing them now would be a drastic and unnecessary action. Ultimately, they do get their time in court, but they don't spend very much time in jail because, lucky for them, they didn't actually get into the safe. So all they could really get in trouble for was breaking into the building.
Okay.
So relatively minor. I mean, not that you should be breaking into buildings, but they didn't actually steal anything. So that's the Milwaukee thing. But we're going to keep going since we've got this guy here.
We're going to hear the rest of his story?
Yes. In May 1963, Florence Guzzino registered the racehorse Celtic Kid. This was likely a front for Sam Guzzino, and the horse was sold a year later. At the time of registration, Florence gave us her references, Chicago Heights Judge Robert Meyer, attorney Silvio Piacente, and Cook County Commissioner Charles Grupp. So her references were some very high-profile people in Chicago Heights. Sam was picked up in August 1964, along with Joseph Barone, for trying to fix a dog race in Daytona Beach, Florida. It doesn't give me specifics on that, but fixing a dog race is always fun.
Wasn't this, and this was the same guy that had previously, earlier on in the story, had some connection to Florida, didn't he?
Yes.
Which is interesting. So he must have had some tight-knit people in Florida.
Yeah, and that's actually not uncommon. A lot of the Chicago mob guys would go back and forth between Chicago and Florida a lot. That's pretty typical. In August 1965, he went to the Arlington Park horse race track. He was picked up there for being a bookie, and then when they looked into it, they saw that he had a past history of doping those dogs in Florida. So he was blocked. He's no longer allowed to go to the Arlington Park. In the 1970s, he owned the Plantation Restaurant and the Florence Sausage Company. So that's nice.
Sounds like he's going legit.
Yeah. He then also owned the Vagabond Lounge in Chicago Heights, a strip club known for gambling and prostitution activities. His brother Richard handled the gambling and the Casey Cab Company that was headquartered there. So his brother had a cab company that ran out of a strip club.
Weird.
Yes. Sam Guzzino was with Al Pilato in July 1981 when Pilato was shot by cab driver Dan Bounds at the Lincolnshire Golf Club. Also present were Rudy Bamonte and Nick Fushi. Probably just ruined those. Pilato survived, and Bounds later confessed to the Chicago Crime Commission, saying he was forced to commit the failed murder by Sam Guzzino. Turns out Sam Guzzino was Dan Bounds' former father-in-law. He had divorced Sam's daughter, and Sam made a deal with him that if he would assassinate his mob buddy, he would arrange it so that Dan could spend more time with his children. Did that make sense?
Kind of. It's kind of creepy, right?
Yeah. So Sam Guzzino and Al Pilato are two mob guys. They're out golfing. A guy shows up and shoots Al Pilato, who survives.
Okay.
The guy turns out to be the former son-in-law of Sam Guzzino, who wants Pilato shot. And he gets his former son-in-law to do it, not because he's a mob guy, he's not, but because he doesn't have custody of his own children, which would be Sam's grandchildren.
Oh, okay. So he says, you do this, I'll make sure that you can see the kids.
If you murder a guy for me, I'll let you see your children.
Wow.
Yeah. I want to make this very clear because it's a weird setup. I want you spending time with my grandkids only if you murder a dude.
Do it for me.
Yeah. 2 weeks after Nick DeAndrea's corpse was found in the trunk of a burning car, Guzzino was found dead in a ditch just east of Beecher, Illinois, which I don't know where Beecher is, but he was shot in the head and also had his throat slashed.
Ooh.
Following Guzzino's murder, Richard Guzzino, his brother, Dale Costello, and Robert Chirachi, that one I'm sure I'm messing up, they fled the Chicago area and took up residence in Alaska, of all places.
Wow.
Yeah, so just a super summary of his life. So this comes up on our timeline because he's involved in a grocery store burglary in South Milwaukee. But this isn't just like some small time burglar. Like
no.
he goes on to running clubs and restaurants and ordering people to murder people, and then himself getting both shot and his throat slashed.
I assume, did you look into like him getting killed? Was that an unsolved murder? Like they have no idea who did it? Or
it's an unsolved murder. Yeah.
Like most of them are.
Like most of them are. Yeah. Yeah, and even like the El Pilato shooting, I think that would have remained unsolved, except for the fact the guy, wasn't a mob guy. So I think he kind of came clean on that one because he wanted to see his kids, and at that point he probably thought it was better to turn in his father-in-law.
And you said when he did the bank robbery in Milwaukee, it was the Milwaukee mob's attorney that actually helped him get out of it. So did you find, like, I assume that the Milwaukee mob is the one that brought him in to be the lawyer on this thing. So, but did you find anything with communication between them to set that up, or
No.
are we just assuming that that's the reason he was brought into it? I mean, it's pretty reasonable assumption, but
Right. Well, so I'll answer that, but I got to step back to answer it. So I don't see any connection, like as far as communication goes. I definitely think it's likely that when they got in trouble, they said, hey, Milwaukee mob, who's
a good
use?
person to get him out of
I don't think it's just a coincidence that he's the attorney they hired. I'm sure that he was referred. But I'm going to step back and say this thing today that we're talking about, this came about in a backwards way. Because once upon a time, this is many years ago now. This is over 10 years ago. This is when I lived in Madison, which, listeners don't know when that is, but that was a while back. And a guy contacted me and he asked if I wanted to co-write with him an encyclopedia on the Chicago Mafia. And obviously it never happened. We don't have that, but we did some crazy work on that. So we got, hundreds of FBI files, tons and tons of government documents, thousands upon thousands of Chicago newspaper articles. We went all out. So I've got tons of information on Chicago mob guys, sitting in a folder on my computer that doesn't do anything. It just sits there. But anyway, the reason I say this is, so I was putting together the entry on Sam Guzzino, and that's how this came up. Had I just been doing the Milwaukee mob stuff, I don't know that this story would have ever come to my attention because it doesn't really have a Milwaukee link other than the attorney.
Right.
So it's if there was some communication there, and there probably was to a point, it's not obvious from the record. But it is also weird to me that they're burglarizing this store in South Milwaukee because traditionally you're not supposed to do things in other people's territory. And I feel pretty confident that South Milwaukee would be Milwaukee territory. So I feel like they would have had to get the okay before they did that. I could be wrong, but typically that's how that works. You wouldn't do that because you're supposed to at least ask, hey, is this store owned by somebody that we're not supposed to screw with? So
because that store owner could be paying for protection from Milwaukee.
Exactly.
Mobs or something, and
exactly.
You can't go up there and hit it if they're taking protection.
Right. Or it could be, or it could be owned by a cousin of somebody. It could be any number of reasons that you shouldn't hit that store. So it seems to me that they would have cleared it first, but I don't know. We don't have that. We don't have those records.
Can you think of a reasonable reason why would for some reason Milwaukee have brought these guys up from Chicago to do this hit on I can't in my head think of a reason why they would ever do that. But
yeah, not really.
So
yeah, there's reasons to do things like that. As far as it's easier to get people from out of town to do things because you don't get recognized. So there's that. Milwaukee had plenty of burglars as well. But it could be, if you burglarize it and then you're running from the cops might know who you are. So it makes more sense to call in somebody from however many miles away. It's a pretty good distance.
But in that situation, you're much better off. They were pretty tight with Racine guys.
Right.
It probably would have just made more sense to have a Racine guy come up and do it or something.
No, and
that.
I agree. I agree. So it's very odd to me. I think there's something not quite adding up, but the fact that they got the Milwaukee attorney to represent them, it had to have been okay on some level. Because otherwise they would have, instead of saying, hey, here's the attorney you should use, they would have said,
no, you're coming in, you're coming in our territory. What are you doing?
Yeah, and then they would have had to have a sit-down meeting, and they would have got chewed out, maybe worse. So I think there's a piece of the story missing here, but this is what I have, so it's what we get.
I got just another thought on this. So you talked about this is these guys are from Chicago Heights,
right?
So which I assume down in Chicago there's multiple different like factions of the mafia, more or less, different areas and things like that.
Yeah, so like how Chicago works is there's like the top guy, same as any other mob city, but it's more fractured, where there's like 5, I don't know what it is today, but there used to be like 5 different neighborhoods. There was Chicago Heights, there was the West Side, North Side, Chinatown. There were different neighborhoods, and they all kind of had their own
little
boss.
Mafia, but
he still answered to the big guy, but they kind of ran day-to-day things by themselves. So like in Chicago Heights at this time, it's Frank Laporte. Frank Laporte would be the guy who runs Chicago Heights. And Frank Laporte knew guys in Milwaukee. Like, he was very good friends with Frank Legelbo, who we haven't talked about him in a while, but he used to come up all the time.
Yeah.
Because he was involved in, well, not necessarily involved in, but his name came up during some murder investigations. His uncle was like the biggest pimp in Milwaukee for a while, and they were very tight. So it's possible there was some backdoor communication here. I don't know.
So like, but as far as the neighborhoods in Chicago go,
yeah,
was there like neighborhoods, I guess would be the term, like subchapters of the main Chicago Mafia,
right,
that Milwaukee was more tight with? You know what I mean? Like, did they do a lot of work with Chicago Heights as opposed to maybe Chinatown or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, I've never really thought about it, but I suppose probably. Definitely the North Side has more overlap for obvious reasons because it's, the North Side. But yeah, Chicago Heights has some overlap. Not so much. Yeah, I don't know that the Chinatown guys really did anything. A couple of the Chinatown guys would have summer homes in Lake Geneva, so they'd come into the area. But that's pretty typical. A lot of Chicago people have summer homes in Lake Geneva. But yeah, Chicago Heights, I think there's more overlap, and the North Side's more overlap. But yeah, not so much some of the other ones. I don't know. I never really put a lot of thought into that. but yeah, I think that's probably fairly fair.
So it would make sense that you're saying there is some overlap here. So it would make sense that possibly either they discussed this hit on this store,
yeah,
or they did it and then Milwaukee was kind of like, well, what the hell? But they didn't really care about the store for any reason, so they might have just been like, "What? Yeah, whatever. It's fine that you did it." Or,
yeah.
I mean, or do you think that's just a big no-no in the mafia world? That
I think generally you wouldn't do it without an okay.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but that's my general feeling is that when you're in another, I don't know how you say another mafia's territory, but that sounds funny because they're all the same mafia, but they're different. Whatever. They're the same, but they're different.
Right.
And typically, you get clearance because they don't like it when you're trying to expand your territory. That's a huge no-no.
Yeah, it's just like a big slap in their face.
Right.
Like what are you trying to come up and take over us, or what is this play here?
Right. So yeah, I think there was some probably behind the scenes communication. I don't know. I'll look into it a little bit more before the show notes go online. Probably won't answer that question because I highly doubt that exists in the records, but who knows? Maybe we'll find something.
Cool. Well, I think I'm out of questions. Do you got anything else you want to add to this one, or?
No, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a story of a burglary. It just happens to fit where we are in the timeline, and it's an excuse to talk about a Chicago guy. So got to go off on that. He's never going to come up again, but we're kind of talking about it. He's one of the many crazy people connected to all these stories.
All right, then Gavin, go ahead and hit them with your famous contact info.
Yeah, so if you want to reach out, the best way to do that is MilwaukeeMafia@gmail.com. If you don't want to reach out, but you just want to see what I have online, MilwaukeeMafia.com is a great resource for all sorts of stuff. I am on Facebook. We try to discourage it, but if you reach out to me on Facebook, sooner or later I'll respond. They do tend to sit there for a bit because I don't like the way it's set up, but I will get back to it eventually. But email is preferable.
And as always, we do have a wonderful Patreon. You can go to MilwaukeeMafia.com, find the link right there on the main page to click on and join the Patreon. That gets you access to 2 bonus episodes every week.
Not every week.
Or 2 bonus episodes a month.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
We better make sure we get that right.
Hopefully you've heard that enough that you just know, but and you can just chuckle at how stupid Eric is.
No, but you don't want to mislead them. They're not getting 2 bonus a week. We're not on that kind of time.
So, but so get over there, join the Patreon. Otherwise, if you can always leave us a review on your favorite podcast player, and we will be back next week with a new Patreon episode, and in 2 weeks with a regular Mafia episode. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Milwaukee Mafia Podcast. Join us next time for another look back at Wisconsin Mafia and true crime history.